All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Aim High, a history of militarized space. With the end of World War II, a host of new technologies emerged, including advanced radar, ballistic rockets, and nuclear energy. It was here that the U.S. military space program began. Solar System Ambassador David S. Ball, who's a volunteer educator with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, will trace the history of our military forays into orbit. David served 26 years in the U.S. Air Force, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. So again, I want to thank, in general, the Friends of the Library who sponsor most of our programs. And we have a few other libraries who helped spread the word. I will thank them in the chat and in the follow-up email. So all 55 of us who are watching live, and hopefully the other 200 or so that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to David for joining us this morning. And David, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Robert, with all that energy, that's wonderful. Well, I'm wearing my Air Force shirt because it's I'm a big fan of not only of NASA, but having served in the Air Force. So I have a real interest in where the military fits into us in space. So let me share my screen here. I'm so grateful to Robert and the Tewksbury Library because you make it possible for us to be able to talk about these things. And it's a wonderful platform, and I'm grateful. Apparently, about 200 people signed up, which means that about that many people are going to end up watching this. Maybe not right now, but they'll certainly have a chance to take a look. So, I wanted to talk today about the military in space, and I'm calling this Aim High because that was kind of like the Air Force tagline when they're trying to get people to join the military. And when you think of a history of militarized space, it's like, well, you know, haven't we like not decided to go into space in a military way? I mean, isn't space for peaceful applications? Well, actually, the military's been in space for half a century, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So think about these two questions. Is it inevitable that conflict and aggression are going to spill out into space? We obviously have it on the Earth, but do we have to take it into the heavens? And here's another question. Could the militarization of space be good? Is there some reason that we might want that? Does it have some value? Could it be desirable? So just kind of put those two kinds of things in the back of your head as we examine the military in space. So the United Nations has talked about this for a while. So at a plenary meeting in December of 1958, the question of the peaceful use of outer space came up. The General Assembly, recognizing the common interest of mankind in outer space and recognizing that it is the common aim that outer space should be used only for peaceful purposes, and bearing in mind that Article 2, Paragraph 1 of the Charter states that the organization is based on the principles of sovereign equality for all its members, wishes to avoid the extension of national rivalries into this new medium. So in doing so, by 1967, there was a landmark treaty called the Outer Space Treaty. And it had a couple of different elements. It talked about the freedom of exploration, the use of space for the benefit of all mankind, the idea that we're not going to appropriate outer space. So, for example, when we land on the moon and we plant our flag, it's not that that now becomes part of America, which is something that we used to do on Earth a lot. You know, when we got to the South Pole, we would plant a flag and we'd say, this is the United States. And also that we would prohibit nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction from being in outer space. So that was 1967. In 68, there was a rescue agreement that said that, you know, if a capsule came down in your country, you know, that you were going to help to rescue those astronauts, or if you had astronauts that were stuck in space and you could do something to help, in the same way that mariners come to the aid of other sailors that are in distress. So there was a rescue agreement. Then there was a liability convention in '72 talking about, well, if something falls on your house, who's responsible for that? And then in '75, the idea that we would register all objects that go up into space. And registering them is one thing. You wouldn't necessarily have to explain everything about it, because a lot of the stuff that goes into space is national security related. So there are secrets. And then this Moon Agreement in '79 talking about aspects of the space treaty as they apply to the moon. Now we've thought about guns in space for a long time. Here's Tom Corbett, and he's floating around with his gun. And whenever you see a cheesy space movie, they always have their space lasers weapons out. And I wrote here, take the gun, leave the cannoli, because we're kind of used to, in science fiction, seeing spacemen with guns. But if you can't really eat Italian pastries when you've got the space helmet on. I don't know if you saw the Netflix series with Steve Carell called Space Force, but it was I thought it was delightful. And it was both very funny, but also kind of gave you questions about, should the military be in space, and if so, in what capacity? And then we had this. Among grave threats to our national security, American superiority in space is absolutely vital. And we're heading, but we're not heading by enough. I'm sorry, and we're leading, but we're not leading by enough. And very shortly, we'll be leading by a lot. And this is President Trump speaking in December of 2019, when he made the determination that we would have a space force, that it would cleave from the Air Force and become its own service. And so with your own service, you have to have your own emblem. So we have the U.S. Space Force emblem, which looks kind of a lot like Star Trek. And then you've got your uniform, and that kind of looks like Battlestar Galactica. But I mean, I guess it's got to look like something, right? And Battlestar Galactica and Star Trek, I mean, they gave a lot of thought to what something should look like, and we've apparently followed suit. So Douglas Aircraft came up with a secret study, and this is just after the end of the Second World War. And in it, they said, in making the decision as to whether or not to undertake construction of such a craft, and here we're talking about a spaceship, something that could orbit the Earth, it's not inappropriate to view our present situation as similar to that in airplanes prior to the flight of the Wright brothers. We can see no more clearly all the utility and implications of spaceships than the Wright brothers could see fleets of B-29s bombing Japan and air transport circling the globe. And so let's consider this. What should we make of the intentions and capabilities of closed societies? You have something like Russia or North Korea. And should we imagine that they have good intentions, bad intentions? Should we imagine that they are weak militarily, or should we fantasize that they're very powerful? And those things drive policy, right? They determine how it is we interact with these societies, and also how we field our defenses. How much money should we be spending on the military? Well, it kind of depends on who's on the other side, right? And how much capability they have. And if you don't know, then what do? Do you overbuild? Do you hope that you're doing the right thing? So here's Curtis LeMay, who was in charge of Strategic Air Command. The only thing I can say is that from 1958 on, the USSR is stronger than we are, and it naturally follows that if he is stronger, he may feel he should attack. So here we are in the 50s, And we've got this enormous USSR and China and their closed societies. And we know that they have big militaries, but we have no idea how many bombers they have, how many ICBMs, what are their intentions. So, how do you figure these things out? Well, you can fly aircraft along the edges of their country and try to take pictures. And then at some point here, you can see Gary Powers here at the bottom in front of a U-2 spy plane. They would fly over China or over the Soviet Union and take a bunch of pictures. But that was also problematic, right? Because he was shot down in May of 1960, and big embarrassment, and we stopped that program. So that may not be the answer. But how many bombers? I mean, was there a bomber gap? Did they have 50 bombers, 500 bombers, 5,000 bombers? Who knew, right? And then how many planes do we then make? So here on the left, you can see the Spirit, the B-2 bomber, and they cost $1 billion with a B a piece. How many of these do you build? So we kind of, what it says is that we're going up against adversaries that are closed societies. We need more information. We need better intelligence. So one possibility is Project Mogul. And in this case, it's a balloon that sends up a bunch of microphones. They're acoustic sensors. And this is about 1947. And what they're listening for are low frequency disruptions of the upper atmosphere. And these are caused by nuclear explosions. So here they are having these microphones hanging out underneath balloons and listening for explosions. Well, you get a little bit of information from that, but you'd obviously like to get a lot more information, right? So in the 50s, there was another balloon project called Genetrix, which would take photographic imagery, and they would take these enormous balloons and set them loose and have them float over the Soviet Union or over China and take a bunch of pictures. And then when it passed over that country, you could send a signal and it would drop the payload, and you could either fish that out of the water or you could try to catch it with an airplane. And so with this particular project, they launched 448 of these things. They only got back about 10%. And of these, the cameras are snapping away, and these things are just floating on the airstream. They're not being directed. So you don't really know what it is that you're taking pictures of, right? And there are 1 million square miles that you want to shoot. And, we were only able to get pictures of like 8%. And you can't go back and look at it. So if you had a buildup, let's say they were putting, more bombers on this base, you couldn't like go back and look at those pictures. You couldn't go and take more pictures again. So it certainly had its problems. And when it's snapping away, the camera doesn't know what it's taking pictures of. So it's mostly taking pictures of fields and forests. So that didn't work all that well. But our thought was, well, okay, if you could put a camera up in orbit, you could end up going over the same, do a pass over the same place, and you wouldn't have to worry about the wind blowing you around. So we kind of had an interest in looking at reconnaissance from orbit. So our first satellite was Explorer, and then we actually, before that, was Vanguard, and Vanguard had some problems getting off the ground. This envelope here is actually from Vanguard too. And so the thought was, you put up this Agena vehicle and you photograph things, you develop the film in the camera, and it sits in this bucket, in this copper bucket, and you drop it from orbit by parachute, and then you have a C-119 come by with like a little hook and grab this thing and reel it in. And it works sometimes. We lost a lot of these. Sometimes the camera didn't work, sometimes the film broke. So not a perfect system. But we had tried doing this with a television camera, but the resolution was very poor. Photographic film is so much better. So give me one moment. I just want to see if I can. There we go. All right. So let's step back here. At the end of the Second World War, Hap Arnold, who learned to fly, he was around when the Wright brothers were doing their thing. He says that space flight is a critical military capability. This is in 1946. He's saying Air Force needs to get on this. 1954 is the development of the Western Development Division. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles, and one-star General Shriver is in charge of this. And this is out at Vandenberg, and so this is kind of a space asset. The next year, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, this is at Redstone in Alabama, a two-star general, Medeiros, and he's working with Wernher von Braun. And they actually were able to put up America's first satellite, which was Explorer 1. This was after the Naval Research Laboratory, which was working on Vanguard, Project Vanguard, had problems and was unable to kind of get that going. So the research laboratory, was doing their thing around the 50s. They actually date back to the 20s. And they were trying to put this satellite up. And the reason that Eisenhower was interested in going with Vanguard as opposed to Explorer was he saw Vanguard as being seemed a little more civilian, and he didn't really want to make this as a competition between militaries. And then kind of the watershed important year to remember is the International Geophysical Year. This is about 18 months between 1957 and 58, where countries around the world doing science and nature-related things do a bunch of projects. And both the Soviets and the Americans expressed an interest in trying to put something in orbit. And the Russians were first. They were able to do it in October of 1957. They put up Sputnik. And so we were responding to that. And so during that period of time, Eisenhower put together the Advanced Research Project Agency, ARPA. And then within a year or so, they split off the space stuff and just the high-tech military stuff and created something called DARPA. And DARPA still exists today. Also during that period of time, the NACA, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, which we started in 1915 in response to the Great War, those resources were put into a new agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in October of 1958. And then just a couple of years ago, we spun off from the Air Force, the United States Space Force. And now the Space Force, we'd kind of been thinking about this for a while. So the first discussions about this were during the Eisenhower administration. And it was thought that the Air Force could handle any of the space stuff, that it made the most sense to have that. And instead of creating a new bureaucracy, we were just going to keep any of our space-related stuff either in a civilian agency with NASA or with DoD under the Air Force. During Reagan, when we were looking at the Strategic Defense Initiative, there was also some more discussion about breaking out the Space Force from the Air Force. But at the time, it was an expense that we really didn't need to do. The Air Force was handling things, and I mean, the big question from a policy perspective is if the space resources are under the Air Force and the Air Force is used to airplanes, is the Space Force going to be treated as a stepchild? Is it going to get the resources that it requires. And the decision at the time was, no, it's fine. It should stay as part of the Air Force. And then President Trump in 2019 said, no, you know what, we need to make a separate force. And so they created the United States Space Force Act. And now we have our sixth uniformed service, the United States Space Force. So back in the 50s, and we're trying to learn things about things related to space. So here's an Air Force pilot who takes his cat up in an airplane. And I mean, I guess he was told to do this. I don't know that it's not your bring your pet to work day. But here he's got his cat, and he's doing a zero-G maneuver where you zoom up and then you push the stick down and you're going down and everything's kind of floating, including the kitten, who is trying to right itself, but it doesn't quite know what to do. So I think that this probably worked maybe once. The second time that he tried to take his cat to his airplane, I'm sure the cat would say, "I'd rather go to the vet than get in your airplane." I want to tell you an origin story about manned military spaceflight. And this is about a Boeing product in the 1960s. So Silbervogel, Vogel, German for silver bird, was a liquid-propelled rocket that was going to be a bomber. And they called this the Sanger skip bomber, because what it would do is it would go up as like a ballistic missile. And then when it arced over, there's a great deal of atmospheric heating. And so that this plane wouldn't melt, you would pull up and it would kind of skip on the atmosphere and kind of cool off so that the structures didn't melt. And then it would dip back into the atmosphere. So you could do these flights, a glide flight of a manned bomber that could fly thousands of miles. So you could have it take off in Germany, skip on the atmosphere a couple of times, and then attack the United States. So this technology, they were looking at this proposal in the late 1930s. And so the idea was that you use the vehicle's wings, they generate lift, and you dip in and out of the atmosphere and keep the structure cool. And it turns out when they did some advanced modeling that it didn't really work because the aircraft would melt. The majority of aircraft components are made out of aluminum, which melts at a pretty low temperature. But this is the origin of dynamic soaring, or the dinosaur, which Boeing came up with, the X-20. And this is the X-20. And the thought was that it would have a variety of military applications. It could do reconnaissance, it could do bombing, it could rescue in space, it could work on satellites, or it could be an interceptor. You could have it fly in space and shoot at an enemy satellite. So it was going to be a Swiss Army knife. The program ran from the late 50s to 1963, and they put a ton of money into it, $6 billion, and it never flew with a pilot in it. So they broke it into three sections: Dinosaur 1, 2, and 3. The first one was the research component. The thought was that they would have a glide flight, then they'd start with powered flights, they'd get it up to Mach 18, and an orbital velocity, by the way, is Mach 25. And they would have that kind of up and running by 63. And then the second part was called Brass Bell, and there they'd be able to demonstrate strategic bombing capabilities. And then the Robo, which was the skip bomber part, was a robotic bomber that they would have this glide missile with a fully operational weapons system by the mid-1970s. And you can see that this aircraft looks a lot like the space shuttle, and it has a lot of the same kinds of characteristics associated with the space shuttle. But for some reason, the United States just has a real bad propensity to name things poorly. So naming a program dinosaur, it seems like a bad idea just from the start. And this program, called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, was part of Project Gemini. So Gemini was the two-manned program in between Project Mercury, which was get somebody into orbit, and Project Apollo, which was get someone on the moon. So in Gemini, we're learning how to do spacewalks, we're creating fuel cells, we're doing rendezvous and docking, managing two spacecraft in orbit at the same time. Lots of new kinds of technologies that we're going to need if we're going to go to the moon. So during Project Gemini, there was a military component called Gemini B or Gemini Blue. And this is the Air Force, and they have their own capsule. And instead of getting in and out of the doors with the windows, they cut a hole in the hatch of the heat shield. They cut a hole in the heat shield. And the thought was that they would go into the back of this rocket in the booster. And the booster, instead of being full of fuel, was going to be an observation platform where we could spy on the Russians. And this was going to launch out of Vandenberg because it needs to be in a polar orbit. But it had challenges, and the challenges were not primarily space related. They really had to do with funding. And so with the Vietnam War sucking this down, at some point, other kinds of technology, the ability to do remote sensing from satellites, ends up being a lot more efficient, a lot more cost effective than trying to put two astronauts up in a tin can for a month. And then the idea that we could target satellites. So we started this with High Virgo. This was fired from a B-58 from the Hustler, and it was this Thiokol missile. The same people that make the solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle. And it would have an operational range of about 185 miles. And you could be flying along and you'd fire off one of these weapons. It would go up into space and destroy a satellite. And so there was Virgo, then there was Bold Orion. And what Orion did was it would send telemetry to the ground, and it would eject flares that you could see. And so it's being continuously tracked. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to hit a satellite that's going 17,000 miles an hour. You're trying to hit it with a missile. So this is pretty tough stuff. And so they're continually tracking this thing, and they're trying to attack one of our satellites as a test, the Explorer 6. And it's at an altitude of about 150 miles. And it passed within 4 miles, which if you set off a nuclear weapon, if you set off a 5 megaton nuclear weapon, no, 1 megaton nuclear weapon, it has a blast range of about 5 miles. So with these, it's like horseshoes and hand grenades. If you're close, you're like close enough. You don't have to actually hit it. With some of the later weapons, for example, this one that's fired from an F-15 Eagle, we're looking for a kinetic hit. We're looking to actually hit the satellite. So in 1985, and I remember this, a Strike Eagle is flying out of Vandenberg, and he pulls up and he fires this missile, and this satellite is flying at 350 miles above the Earth, and it's flying, Mach 25, and this pilot fires this weapon, and it goes up there and destroys the satellite. And it has a closing speed of 15,000 miles an hour. It's unbelievable technology. So now we can start shooting at each other in space, right? And we don't even have to go to space to do it. We can shoot from airplanes. So I was looking at the budget for different countries around the world. And so I looked at the US one, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that we do, right? We do different satellite communications, um, optical communications with lasers, satellite imagery, um, missile warning, different kinds of tracking things, having our global positioning satellite equipment. All of these things are space related. Uh, they're either things that we have on the ground that we're using to track, or we've got satellites up there that are helping us to communicate or helping us to coordinate attacks when we're using our military. Lots of different things. So here it says that the US Space Force was asking for $832 million on top of the $17.4 billion for the unfunded priority list of wishes. So we do a lot in military space. And then I looked at other countries, and the stuff that they had on their list was pretty short. Now, there's certainly some countries that are doing more than others, but most of them are communications, or their weather, or that sort of thing. Russia and China do have some additional capabilities in terms of, like, China has their own space station. They've been able to land on the far side of the moon. They have their own technonauts. They have their own program. Same thing with Russia. They have a number of anti-satellite kinds of capabilities, but most countries are either kind of a surveillance or a communication or weather related, and that's the extent of what their militaries are doing in space. So if you look at the satellite types, you see sometimes it's surveillance, sometimes it's navigation, timing, communications. ISR means reconnaissance, signal intelligence, yeah, that sort of stuff. So when you talk to somebody in the US military now, they talk about being in 5 domains. So there is the sea and under the sea. There's the land, there's being in the air. There's cyberspace, right? That's its own domain. And then there's outer space. And it is an important part of the military now. Not so much that we have Tom Corbett running around in space with a gun, but we would be hard pressed to do what it is that we do without being able to target things with GPS, without having communications, without having our computers, sending information to our weapons systems and to our warfighters. So it's become integral to everything that we do in the military. And I guess what I wonder is, can the aggression that we have on the Earth be contained? So, here we are on the Earth, and we've got an atmosphere, and up there we've got airplanes that are flying around, and then there's a Kármán line, and we separate what we call the Earth and our atmosphere from what we call outer space. But we clearly have stuff up there now. We've got bunches of satellites. We've shot down satellites. There are all kinds of laser energy weapons that are up there, and ones that are in our future. And I wonder, clearly the military is military space is part of who we are and what exists today. But the aggression that we will have in the future, can we keep some of that contained here? Or does that mean that, we're going to be on the moon, right? It's not just going to be America, it's going to be China. It's going to be the Russians or India or, European Space Agency, and they're going to be conflicts. And so is the next thing that's going to happen with the moon? We already have orbiters around the moon and around Mars taking pictures. So the first thing that's going to be at the moon and Mars are going to be ISR platforms, right? Ones that are doing reconnaissance so that we know what's going on, because we know that when people don't talk, when you have a closed society, you start to wonder whether or not, what are your intentions? What are your capabilities? So we're going to be spying on people, right? But does it extend beyond that? Do we start having offensive weapons in space, and at the moon and on Mars and beyond? And I don't know what the answer is. Um, it's my hope that somehow we could be smarter the second or the third time around, in the same way that I'm not sure that we've been good stewards of the Earth in terms of taking care of the Earth. And I hope that we don't trash other worlds, and hopefully we can try not to be aggressive in other places. But I wonder if maybe part of that is inevitable. That's all I had. I really wanted to spark a discussion. So do people have thoughts or questions?
So, folks, let's give David a big virtual round of applause for a great job as always. As David said, if you have any questions, please get them into the Q&A. If you have any comments, please get them into the chat. So John asks, what role do directed energy weapons systems play in today's Space Force?
That's a great question. When somebody says a directed energy, what they're talking about is a laser, and there are different kinds, and I don't really know. I know there are chemical lasers. There are I can't really speak to it. I will say that that directed energy systems have successfully destroyed things, and I'm sure that they're going to be a big part of our future. I mean, the advantage of using a laser as opposed to something else is, in Ukraine, when they're firing missiles at each other, you have to keep loading the thing with more missiles. With a directed energy, all you have to do is just put some power in it, and you can keep lasing it, sending pulses and destroying stuff. So that's definitely our future.
Richard asks, are there any armed satellites in orbit now that we are aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. Let me simply say that the first thing past having the satellite is the military has gone to try to harden their capabilities. So if a nuclear weapon goes off in space, it generates a great deal of energy, and when that energy reaches the satellite, it can destroy the circuitry. So it's something called an electromagnetic pulse. So one of the first things that the military does, in addition to making the satellite for whatever purpose it is they try to harden it. They try to make it so that if a nuclear weapon were to go off in the proximity of the satellite, that it would not destroy the capabilities of that satellite. So at this point, I would imagine that a good percentage of the military satellites and stuff are hardened against EMP. Now, whether or not there's stuff up there that can shoot at you or defend itself or stuff, I don't know. I'm sure that's in the discussion phase, if not already a reality.
Ginny asks, I have heard that we are worried that other countries may claim parts of the moon or Mars as their own territory when they physically land. Is this a real concern?
It certainly is to some people. I guess the question is, should it be? Now, on the Earth, when we show up at the North Pole or the South Pole, and we put a flag down and we say that this is part of the United States. We're colonizing this, or we're claiming this for the king or something like that. There are some consequences to that. So if you have a place that you claim, then you feel an obligation to defend it. So if somebody comes onto this piece of land that you say is yours, then you have a conflict, and you get into a fight. Also, when you claim a place, you claim an area of the ocean, or some land that has minerals on it, or it has oil, or it has there may be economic issues associated with a place that you claim. Now, does that extend to the moon and Mars? I mean, I'm sure that there are valuable minerals that you could extract from the moon, and maybe they're not uniformly present. So it might be that somebody shows up and they claim this area and it's got a lot of titanium, and they start mining that, or they land at the South Pole and there's water there, and water's very useful. So they claim that. They claim, the water rights to this part of the moon. How do we handle that? I mean, if you talk to Native Americans before the Europeans showed up and you said, okay, so you're going to own this part of the earth and you're going to own this part of the earth, they would laugh at you. They'd say, well, the earth isn't something that you own, it's some place that you live. And yet in our society, and for the last 100 years, 1,000 years, couple of thousand years, we've had this thought that we establish what area is ours, and then we defend it. And that may very well extend. We may very well find that on the moon and on Mars. We specifically said when we landed on the moon in '69 that we were not claiming territory by being there. But whether or not others, will do that in the future, or whether we'll do that in the future, I don't know.
Edward says, during the Reagan administration, we heard about StarNet, the ability to protect ourselves against nuclear war. The Russians almost went broke trying to build such a system. Is there anything going on like that now?
Yeah, a lot of these questions, which are excellent questions, are ones that deal with national security, are classified, and I have no idea. I will say that it's my belief that that the Soviet Union collapsed not because our military was stronger than theirs, but because we had a military race with them, and economically they collapsed. That we talked about having this shield that was going to protect us and our friends, and then when the Russians tried to do that, they just collapsed. And I believe that. I believe that they collapsed because they were trying to compete with us and our SDI Star Wars stuff.
This may be another question that only has a classified answer, but Richard asks, the Space Force flies The Space Force flies a space plane now. I think it's the XB-30. It stays up for a year. Do you know what it's actually doing?
Okay, I think he's talking about the X-37. It's smaller and it kind of looks like the space shuttle. And yeah, sometimes it goes up for like a year. Yeah, it's developing, a lot of those capabilities that we were talking about with Dinosaur, right? Being able to do reconnaissance work. They could probably do rescue. I mean, I think you could fit maybe a half a dozen people in it. It doesn't have any windows on the outside, but I guess you don't need that. But it's developing those kinds of capabilities that we talked about earlier with Dinosaur, the ability to do reconnaissance. I would imagine that it could inspect satellites, it could rescue people in space, things like that. I'm sure it has lots of capabilities.
Tom asks, is the blast range of a nuclear weapon the same in the vacuum of space as it is in the atmosphere?
Oh, I would think not. I would think not. when you compress the air, at ground level, or an airburst of a nuclear weapon, the air itself ends up pushing on you and flattening you or destroying you. I'm not suggesting that in space that's necessarily less, but it's definitely different. It's very different. And I think the principal impact of nuclear weapons being detonated in space is probably the electromagnetic pulse, that you're generating a tremendous amount of energy, and that's overwhelming the circuitry on spacecraft. And so unless they're hardened, if you were to detonate a nuclear weapon in space near one of our satellites, it would disable it.
Shane says, thanks for speaking up for the planets. Jamie has a couple of good questions. I don't know if they're like exactly relevant to today's topic. They're kind of adjacent. We'll get to those if we have time. An anonymous attendee says, thank you. I was going to ask about minerals on the moon. Tom asks, what can you tell us about the manned orbiting laboratory program that was canceled in 1969?
Well,
do you know anything about that, David?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the thought was, if you took up a booster and you made the interior dry, you could have that as a laboratory, and they'd have it up for about 30 days, and then it would fall into the atmosphere and burn up. Think about it like Skylab. So Skylab went up in May of 1973 and operated until, well, it was in 74, and they had crews up there for a couple of months. So it was a portion of the Saturn 1B, and they would float around in the inside of this tin can, and they took a bunch of pictures, and they had a telescope on it and things like that. And that's what these Air Force officers were going to do in the manned orbiting laboratory. There was a hole that they cut in the back of the heat shield, and they would crawl from the spacecraft into the empty booster, and they'd be there for a month taking pictures of the Russians. And then when the month was over, they'd crawl back into the Gemini capsule, they'd re-enter into the atmosphere and come back safe. And one of the big questions was, if you cut a hole in the heat shield, does that disturb the heat shield, and would you burn up? And they only did one test of MOL, and that was in November of 1966, with an unmanned capsule that did have the hole cut in it, and it came back fine. So there weren't any technological reasons why MOL couldn't work. It was more just that it took so long and cost so much that at that point we had unmanned systems going up that were just as capable, so it just didn't make any sense.
James asks, are there any agreements between countries regarding the use of outer space?
There are. We've said that we're not going to detonate nuclear weapons in outer space, although we've done that. We've detonated in outer space before in the early 60s. We've done all kinds of things. We did one, I think it was called Starfish, where we sent out like 100,000 little like BBs or something floating out into space, and done all kinds of I don't want to say dumb, but disruptive, dangerous kinds of things in space. But at this point, no one is detonating nuclear weapons in space, and that's probably a good thing.
John asks, can you speak to the concept of full spectrum dominance in the military doctrine?
Well, simply to say that one of the things that surprises people in the war between the Russians and the Ukrainians is when we see drone pictures of all of a sudden tanks blowing up, and we think to ourselves, how stupid is that? Why don't they just, why aren't they in a different place, or why don't they have their Air Force come in and clear the skies? And one of the things that we've done, in addition to having better equipment, better tanks, better airplanes, is we have something called combined arms. And in combined arms, you're communicating between the Army and the Air Force. And so you have infantry that are working to clear areas for the tanks and supporting that, and the tanks are providing cover for the infantry. And so in addition to communicating with each other, they soften up the beach, or the different services interact and support each other. So it's not just the Army and the Air Force or the Navy, but it's being able to do targeting. If you have reconnaissance, and then you're able to put a laser dot on something and send a smart weapon to destroy it. So being able to coordinate all of the different capabilities that you have, and also cyber, gives you a dominance that any one system, just having tanks or just having airplanes, doesn't get you. There is a synergy related to being able to say, hey, I see a target, and someone being able to go and attack it. So that's the secret sauce that the United States has right now that most countries don't. Not just that we have great tanks, but that we have the coordination of our cyber and our communications and our laser range finders and our special forces guys and stuff like that. So it's, when we talk about that kind of dominance, it's a dominance of being able to tie all these things together. And the thing that normally ties them together are things related to space.
David asks, Trump's attitude seems pretty hawkish. Do you have any thoughts of how a more dove-like approach to developing this defense domain might look like?
Well, when I did some reading, I was reading about the Eisenhower administration. Now, Eisenhower was a commanding general during the Second World War. So, I mean, he's certainly not he's not a dove. Okay. I mean, he certainly has no problem with armed conflict. But in the 50s, when there were a lot of calls about the missile gap and about the bomber gap, and what are the Russians doing, he tried not to get into an arms race, tried not to get into a space race. When the Soviets put up Sputnik, he's like, oh, well, that's pretty good. I mean, that's a scientific achievement. And he was trying to be low key about it. So you wonder what kinds of things are going on behind the scenes. What things do we not see in terms of how we interact with other countries, and how we support our friends? I don't know. It's a good question, but I don't know.
So we're going to take 8 more minutes of questions. We'll wrap up around 11:35 Eastern, because we did start about 5 minutes late. I hit the record button around 10:35, so we'll go to 11:35. Jamie asks, can you talk about the colonization of the moon and Mars and establishing bases there to explore the outer limits of space?
Well, NASA has said that they're going to go to the moon, and they're going to go to Mars, and the thought is that they'll be on the moon within the next 5 or 6 years, and I think we'll be on Mars within 10. And the thought is that in the past, when we went to the moon, between the summer of '69 and the end of 1972. We sent 24 Americans, 12 of them walked on the face of the moon, and the longest stay was about 2 days. The thought is now that we're going to go back there and stay. We're going to actually create a colony there. You need to be able to grow your own food. You need to deal with water and oxygen and radiation and all that kind of stuff. And when something breaks, you can't go out to the hardware store. You have to make it on a 3D printer, or you have to have brought it with you. So yeah, we're gonna go back to the moon. We're gonna stay there, create a colony, and with Mars, we've been saying we're gonna go to Mars in 10 or 15 years. We've been saying that since I was a kid. When we walked on the moon, I was 10 years old, and they said, "Well, we'll be on Mars in 10 years." And it's always been 10 or 15 years from now. But it's because we don't finance it. We don't have the national will to say we're going to do it. But Elon Musk and SpaceX have said we're going to Mars. And so when he says we're going to be there in 10 years, I believe it.
Yeah, and that touches on John's question. John asks, in the past, everything being done in space was by governments, but now we have private corporations like SpaceX and Amazon's venture playing an increasing role. Can you speak to these current developments? And I know, David, you did a whole talk on this, I think 6 months ago or so for us, but why don't you give us a very brief synopsis?
Well, just to say, I think it's very exciting. When private industry gets involved in something, they're able to deliver vast resources and a very focused action plan. You know, they don't want to dilly-dally. They want to get in there and make some money. And one of that's a strength of private industry. For governments, I think that the strength is that we're doing things because we're doing them for everybody. So when Elon Musk decides that he wants to go to Mars, he's going to do it. He's going to do it, and he's going to make money. And that's something that at this point we're not able to do. And so I love it when NASA went to the moon, but I think it's even more exciting when people like Musk and Jeff Bezos and those guys decide, hey, we're going to go out and explore the universe. The downside is if they decide the next day that they're tired of that, they don't want to do that, they put their rockets away and go home, then there's nothing we can do about that. So it's exciting, and I look forward to seeing it every day.
Okay, that touched a little bit on Ginny's question as well. Let me ask Jamie's other question. Can you speak more about the profitability of mining asteroids for rare earth metals and minerals? And I did see maybe 6 to 9 months ago that Netflix movie, Don't Look Up. So this question reminds me of that premise. So anyway, profitability of mining asteroids for rare metals and minerals.
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, I remember watching, if you've watched Apple TV, they have a series called For All Mankind. And in that, they go and they capture an asteroid for mining. You have to think that if it costs $10,000 to lift a pound into orbit, the idea of taking a spacecraft off someplace to go and mine in outer space and bring stuff back here has got to be ridiculously expensive. So it's clear to me that it's going to happen, in the same way that people go up towards the North Pole to go and find gold. But it's going to be incredibly, the bar required to get to the point where you can bring back the first pound of whatever it is going to be ridiculously high. So I don't imagine that there's going to be mining in the next several years. You would think that the first things that happen are going to be the exploration and the colonization and things like that. I mean, from the business perspective, they certainly want to do that, but I would think that they would mine the moon and Mars and stuff before they're able to do large scale things with asteroids.
An anonymous attendee wants to know if you're familiar with the YouTuber Ryan Macbeth and his military analysis.
No, there's so much wonderful stuff on YouTube. I'll have to look them up.
Two more questions, and then I'll run through some comments. Ginny asks, is the Starlink system considered a security risk if it should move out of its orbit and threaten other satellites? Also, what would happen to our communications if Elon Musk decided to cancel the program? He seems to hold all the cards.
Yeah, well, let me speak for a moment about Starlink. So Starlink is not a satellite. It's a constellation. So it's not one satellite, it's hundreds of satellites. It's a couple of thousand satellites. And it turned out, and here's the analogy. When we had a stock market 100 years ago, if you got information half a day sooner, an hour sooner than somebody else, you could go into the stock market and make some money because you had information someone else didn't. Well, we've gotten to the point where if you could get information about what's going on in the stock market a second before somebody else did, you could trade and make some money. So one of the things that Elon Musk has done is he's put this constellation of satellites up, Starlink, and they're in low Earth orbit. And by low, I mean they're like 300 miles up, something like that. And it turns out that the time it takes for a signal to get from low Earth orbit, as opposed to one that's, let's say, in geosynchronous orbit, which is 22,000 miles away, it ends up being important. And if you can shave a couple of milliseconds off your communications, you end up being able to have your computers trade on the stock exchange and make money. So the time it takes to send stuff in Starlink is less than it is for other kinds of communications. So from a business perspective, people are making money because his satellites are very low in orbit. The problem with being low in orbit is you have to put up more satellites and they fall back to Earth sooner. So he puts up lots of them. He puts up 60 at a time, and he's launching these things every week. So they're going up in Earth orbit. Maybe they're only up there for 6 months or a year or something. They fall back. So that's part of his business model. That's what he's doing. And in terms of if he decides that he doesn't want to do that anymore, he could certainly do that. Or maybe let's say he finds that it's profitable to be going to Mars and not putting up Starlink anymore. Then the Starlinks are going to like fall down to Earth, and that's going to be that. There are other people that have satellite constellations, and the military has satellite constellations. So he's not the only game in town, but he is the biggest, and he's doing the most exciting things.
Final question, and this is like our 20th question or thereabouts. Peter wants to know, was it necessary to create the Space Force?
It depends on who you speak to. My opinion is it was not. There was a bunch of discussion in the Second World War about whether or not part of the Army should be broken off into its own service, that we should have an Air Force as well as an Army. And there were a lot of people advocating, and they were saying, you know what, we have all the infrastructure in the Army Air Corps. Why make another service? In retrospect, we ended up making the Air Force in 1947. In retrospect, yeah, it was a baby that needed to be born, and it's become an adult, and it's been, an important contributor to our national defense. And, is the Space Force like that? I don't think that there was any particular need. I mean, I think the number of people in the Space Force right now is about 8,000 people, and in the Air Force is probably 250,000, something like that. So it's a very small group, and what they've done is they've simply taken the programs that the Air Force was running well, and now they've put it underneath the logo of the Space Force. So I don't really think it needed to be different, but clearly some people thought that there was an advantage, and that was the decision the president made. And I think, 50 years from now, we're going to look at it and we're going to say it's fine.
All right, I'm going to run through some comments real quickly, and then I'm going to turn back to you if you have any parting thoughts, and then we're going to wrap it up. So a silent observer writes, very interesting and things I had not thought of. Dory says, very informative, great presentation, thanks very much. Carol says, great and thought-provoking presentation. Frank says, bravo, fascinating. Judy says, great and interesting. Tom notes that he worked on the orbital workshop, the Skylab, at McDonnell Douglas in 1969 when the MOL was canceled. Edward says, thanks for a very interesting program. Tom says it would be great to send Elon to the moon. Astronomers are not happy about all the satellites obstructing observations. John says, thank you for this fascinating presentation. So, David, any last words before we wrap it up?
No, I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to talk about these kinds of things. You have wonderful viewers who have great questions, and I would simply say that if you want to hear more topics on space, please do the feedback session with Robert and invite me back.
Yeah, that's a great segue. So, folks, look for an email from me later today with a link to this recording, a link to the feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming virtual programs. I tend to book David 4 to 6 times a year. I'm sure we'll have him again. But please fill out that survey. Let us know what topics you'd like to see him speak on in the future. So thank you all so much. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. And for those who celebrate, have a happy Easter. So thanks so much, David, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Robert.
Bye-bye.